Hello, class. We are going to start our new unit. Our unit is going to be about genetics and pedigrees, and you're going to find that information in chapters 9 and 12 in your biology book. So please read. That will help you understand all the information. It's in more detail than what our notes are. So book is always helpful. So chapters 9 and 12. All right, so we're going to start out today talking about the vocabulary that you're going to need to know to understand how to do the genetics problems. That's what we'll be focusing on for most of this unit. So what is genetics? Genetics is the study of heredity, and heredity is the passing on of genetic information from parents to offspring. So hopefully we know that genetic information is your DNA in your cell, right? So that's what we're passing on. We're passing on the DNA, and that DNA is our genetic information. So where do we find the DNA? We find the DNA in the nucleus, right? So here's your cell, here's your nucleus. That's where we're going to find the DNA. When we see it, the DNA is all wrapped up tightly into what's called a chromosome. And you have 46 total chromosomes. So you can see the picture down here. You have 46 total or 23 pairs, right? So notice the numbers 1, 2, 3. So we go to 22 and then we have XY. So you have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Basically, you got one set from your mom and one set from your dad. So your mom gave you like number 1 chromosome, a number 2 chromosome, a number 3 chromosome, a number 4 chromosome. But then your dad also contributes a number 1 chromosome, a number 2 chromosome, a number 3 chromosome. So you get one copy of a full set from your mom and one copy of a full set from your dad. They match up. So we're going to talk about them being homologous. So they match up. They have the same genes for the same characteristics. So if we look here, gene is DNA coiled up in a small package, a specific part of the chromosome that determines a trait or a protein. So here's DNA, right? When we unravel the chromosome, this is what we see. This is our DNA. And then we can break up the DNA into sections that we call genes. One gene is one trait. One gene, one trait. Now, a trait in general for organisms is a protein. So the way you get that trait is because it makes a certain protein that causes a certain look to happen to you. So again, we have 23 pairs. We get one from our mom, one from our dad. Now, where did our little story of genetics come from? You would think maybe a scientist, but that would be incorrect. It wasn't a scientist who discovered how genetics really works, but instead an Austrian monk. So a monk is a religious person that lives in a monastery with other monks. So they tend to keep to themselves. And in doing so and keeping to themselves, they usually grow their own food. And Gregor Mendel was one of those gardeners. And they grew peas in the garden. And he started just to notice a lot of different things about the peas. And then he started experimenting. Not like he knew it was an experiment, but he actually did run a lot of really good experiments. He wrote it all down in a journal, and that's actually how we know about it today, is from reading his journal. And the information that he discovered really set us on the path to understanding genetics. And so that's why we give him credit for being the father of genetics. Even though he wasn't a scientist, he did excellent science to discover the genetic properties of pea plants in particular. So you can see he looked at a lot of stuff about peas. He was very detail oriented. These are very good characteristics of a scientist. He's very observant, and he took a lot of information. So, you probably never realized that peas could be yellow because we always serve green peas, but peas can be yellow too. And that you probably don't really realize how this whole thing works, right? So peas are usually in the pod. of a pea plant, and that's kind of like their fruit. The pea is actually the seed of the plant, right? So what he did notice is that you could have yellow or green, you could have wrinkled or smooth, you could have purple or white flowers. The pods could look different. You can even have a yellow pod. How the flowers are around the stem are different, and then sometimes they grew tall and sometimes they did not. So, in looking at all these characteristics, he was able to determine the genetics. And some of the words that he determined we still use to this day. And so, for Gregor Mendel, he discovered, hey, we have two of every gene, which we just discussed. You get one from your mom, one for your dad. He didn't really know that because he doesn't even know anything about DNA, but he could tell you get two. Now, you get two, but they're going to be different, right? They're going to be different forms. So, say you got blonde hair from your mom and brown hair from your dad. So, it's the same gene because we're talking about hair color, but you have different, it's going to be for a different trait. So that's called an allele. So when we're talking about hair color, you have two alleles for hair color. And if we look over here in this picture, you would have two alleles for your chin or for, how your hair grows or for dimples so you have two alleles for each gene. Now, what we have learned about the alleles is that usually there's a dominant allele. So whatever you get, you have the two alleles like brown hair, black hair versus blonde hair. Well, you can see here, brown hair, black hair is dominant. What does that mean? Well, if you have one of the brown hair, black hair gene, that's what we're going to see. So that's what is expressed. That's the word we use, the gene that is expressed. So we're going to see brown hair if you have one of the brown hair genes. That's called dominant because it covers up the fact that you actually do have a blonde hair gene, but we don't see blonde hair on you. So we don't know you have the blonde hair gene. Now, the way we show this in problems that you're going to be doing is that we use a capital letter. So a capital letter is the dominant letter. And then the recessive trait, which you can see here, the recessive genes, right? Blonde hair, if that was a recessive trait. We're going to represent all recessive traits with a lowercase letter. And the only way you're going to see a recessive trait is if you have two of them. So you cannot have the dominant. You'd have to have two recessives, and then we see the recessive trait. So you have to get two blonde hair genes in order to have blonde hair. In order to have brown or black hair, you just need one brown or black hair gene. Now, it's a little more complicated than that. That will be in our next lesson. But for now, we'll just go with the basics. Now, this is something we haven't talked about yet, right? Zygote is just a fertilized egg because we are joining sperm and egg to create a new or offspring. And so you have two alleles for every trait because you have two parents. So that goes back to, this picture again. You got one from your mom, one from your dad. So you have two alleles for every trait simply because you have two parents. All organisms who reproduce by sexual reproduction will have two parents. So therefore, they have two versions of the gene. So now that we know that you have two copies of every allele, there's like several versions of what do you have. So you have two copies. So what are the two copies? So you have two choices. Either you have two of the same alleles or you have two different alleles. So if you have two of the same, it's called homozygous. That just means homo means same. So you have two of the same. Now, since there's such a thing as dominant and recessive, there's two ways to be homozygous. Either you're homozygous dominant, which means you have the two capital letters or you have two dominant genes, or you're homozygous recessive. You have two recessive genes. And then, of course, in between, you could have one of each. That would be heterozygous. So you can see that we do use the capital letters and then the lowercase. We always write capital first. So that is our convention, and that's the way you always see me write it. That's how you will always read it in a book. Carrier. So if you're heterozygous, you're technically called a carrier because you have the recessive characteristics, and you can pass it on to to your offspring, but we don't see it. So we don't know. Sometimes we wouldn't know that you have it, but it can get passed on to the next generation. And this is the difference between having seeing families that look very similar and seeing families that look very different. If the two parents are homozygous, they're going to have offspring that look a lot like them because they're giving out the same genes. Where if you have two parents who are heterozygous, that's where you get like a mix of children because they get either the dominant or the recessive genes. And then you see a look in a family that where they look kind of different. And it just really has to do with being homozygous or heterozygous for those traits. And we'll come back to this part about carriers when we move on to the genetics problems, but just keep this in mind. So we'll talk about sex-linked traits later on. And so that you want to be able to note that the information for this is back here in this slide. All right, now as we're talking about the chromosomes that we have, especially we talk about humans, so not every organism has 46. I guess I should tell you that. Mice, horse, whale, cat. Every organism has a different number. So 46 is just our number. It's the human number. But every organism has two pairs. So that's kind of the normal part. Now, when we talk about humans, we're going to talk about autosomes, and autosomes are numbers 1 through 22. So the pairs that we number them 1 through 22, those are all autosomes. And then the last pair of chromosomes we call the sex chromosomes because that's what determines your gender. Are you male or female? That is based off those two chromosomes alone. And so you can see here, to be a female biologically, you would be XX. And to be a male biologically, your chromosome would be XY. So that's what determines male and female, the sex chromosomes. All right, so we're gonna be talking about autosomes and sex chromosomes. So you just have to remember the difference between the two as we move on through this unit. All right, finally, for this section of notes, we're going to talk genotype and phenotype. So genotype are your actual genes. So they're the letters that you have. So if we were doing the capital lowercase situation, and we have our two chromosomes, and the gene is at the same place that we have, and so the actual genotype, capital W, that would be your actual genes, or you could be capital W, lowercase w, or the opposite, right? Or you could be lowercase w. So you can have, these different situations as your genotype. But what is your phenotype? Your phenotype is what you look like. It's your physical characteristics. So normally I write physical and I circle the PH and I say physical, PH physical. So it's what you look like. It's what is expressed because only one gene gets expressed. And so if you look here with the flies, if the dominant gene here is to have normal wings. So having normal wings is dominant. So as long as you have one dominant gene, then you have normal wings. So if you're homozygous dominant, you have normal wings. But if you're heterozygous, you also have normal wings. The only fly that's going to have the wrong wing, the wings that doesn't work really well, that's really hard to say, is homozygous recessive, right? So, and you can imagine this fly probably doesn't really live very well with those wrinkled wings. So that's your phenotype. Your phenotype is what you look like. Your genotype is the letters. And so you're going to have to keep that in mind as we move through this unit with those words. Okay, and so that leads us to Notes Review 1, which is your assignment for today.